Claire Henderson's eyes fluttered open to the soft hum of the airplane engines, though in truth, she hadn't fully slept yet. The kind of sleep that trickled in between daydreams and exhaustion, leaving her in a hazy, almost surreal state. She was in row 13 middle seat, wedged between a bulky backpack and a man snoring softly, whose head nodded rhythmically against the window. The early morning light filtered through the tiny porthole, casting a pale glow across her notebook, half filled with doodles and to-do lists she hadn't had time to finish. She rubbed her temples, trying to shake off the lingering sleep fog, adjusting her seatbelt with mechanical precision. It had been a normal day so far, or at least it had promised to be. She arrived at Logan International in Boston, coffee in hand, rushing past the tired early commuters, weaving through the crowds like a shadow in motion. She had double-checked her ticket, confirmed her gate, and even gave herself a small mental pep talk about staying calm during flights. Flying had always made her nervous, despite her brief flirtations with flight lessons during college. She liked the idea of controlling a plane, but had never imagined herself in any real emergency situation. Yet, here she was, innocently leaning against the window, notebook resting on her knees, unaware that her life was about to pivot in a direction she had never dreamed. The cabin around her was a microcosm of human life. Children pressed their tiny faces against the windows, marveling at clouds that looked like drifting castles. Businessmen tapped on keyboards, screens glowing with spreadsheets and presentations, oblivious to the sky above them. A mother tried to soothe a crying toddler with an almost imperceptible lullaby. Flight attendants moved gracefully down the aisles, offering drinks, blankets, and faint smiles, masking the tension that always seemed to hang somewhere beneath the polished surface of airline protocol. Claire, caught in her own sleepy bubble, barely noticed the subtle murmurs of unease circulating among the passengers. And then it came. A voice crackled over the PA system, startling in its calm urgency. "Is anyone here a pilot?" Claire jolted upright, her notebook tumbling to the floor. For a heartbeat, nothing registered, just the mechanical buzz of the engines, the slight sway of the plane, and the faint scent of recycled air mixed with coffee and perfume. Then slowly the words sank in, curling around her chest like a vice. A pilot. Someone was asking for a pilot, not in jest, not in casual inquiry. The sound carried authority, weight, and a subtle undertone of alarm. Passengers stiffened. Phones were lifted instinctively, fingers hovering over emergency numbers, yet no one seemed to move. A man in the aisle muttered something about "must be a joke," but his eyes betrayed him. They were wide, scanning the cabin, searching for anyone who could possibly step forward. The woman across from Claire clutched her handbag like a lifeline, whispering prayers under her breath. The air shifted. The ordinary Tuesday morning had been ripped from its familiar rhythm and replaced with something sharp, unpredictable, and terrifying. Claire's heart began to race. Her flight lessons had always felt like a game, a controlled environment where nothing real or fatal could happen. She remembered the cockpit simulator vividly, the yoke under her hands, the instruments glowing, the instructor's calm instructions as she fumbled through takeoffs and landings. But this was real. This was steel, engines, hundreds of lives above the Atlantic, and a voice calling for help. Her stomach twisted. Every instinct screamed, "This is not your world. Step back." And yet, there was a strange pull, a surge of something she hadn't felt in years: responsibility. The realization that someone somewhere was counting on a pilot. Maybe it was hundreds of people counting on one. And maybe, just maybe, that someone could be her. Her hand trembled as she reached for the armrest, unsure if she should raise it. Around her, passengers were frozen as though time itself had halted. The flight attendants' practiced smiles had vanished, replaced with quick, anxious glances, whispered conversations, and barely audible instructions. Claire could feel their tension like static in the air. The cabin, once a place of neutral space and gentle routine, had transformed into a pressure cooker of fear, anticipation, and uncertainty. Claire swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. "It's probably nothing," she whispered to herself. Maybe a precaution, maybe, but even as she spoke, the voice came again, sharper, more insistent. Is anyone here trained to fly a plane? The hum of the engine seemed louder now, more menacing, vibrating through her chest. The plane lurched slightly, as if responding to the urgency in the captain's voice. Claire's fingers dug into her seat, nails biting into the fabric, and she realized she could no longer ignore the truth. She was awake now, not just physically, but in the way her mind snapped into focus, calculating, remembering, preparing. Across the aisle, the man in the suit froze mid-grip on his phone. A child whimpered softly. Someone whispered, "Oh God, oh God." The cabin became a maze of frozen faces, each reflecting a different shade of fear. And then Claire felt it, the undeniable, suffocating weight of the moment. People were looking at her, even if they didn't realize it yet. Someone was going to need her, and the thought sank deep into her chest like a stone. She shifted in her seat, gripping the notebook for comfort, though it offered none. Her mind raced. Flight school lessons, simulator hours, memorized procedures. None of it prepared her for real panic. None of it prepared her for hundreds of lives depending on one trembling set of hands. And yet, in the quiet chaos of row 13, Claire felt something else rising, a spark of determination she hadn't known existed. The captain's voice rang out again, carrying urgency and fear, but also a sliver of hope. "We've lost both pilots. Anyone, please, we need help immediately." Claire's breath caught. She looked around the cabin, at the faces frozen in terror, at the hands gripping armrests, at the quiet prayers murmured in desperation. She could run, she could duck, she could pretend she was just a passenger like everyone else. And maybe that would be easier. But as she stared at the locked cockpit door, the hum of the engines vibrating through the fuselage, she knew she couldn't. Her hand rose slowly, almost involuntarily. I can help," she said, her voice barely audible over the murmurs. The plane shuddered slightly, as if testing her resolve, and a hush fell over the cabin. Every eye seemed to lock on her, every heartbeat thudding in unison with hers. A flight attendant pointed toward the cockpit. "This way, quickly." Claire's knees felt weak as she stood, every step down the aisle stretching into an eternity. The faces around her blurred, a mixture of fear, hope, and disbelief. She felt their eyes like weight on her back, their silent prayers following her with each careful step. The metallic scent of the cabin filled her nostrils, mingling with the faint aroma of coffee and the adrenaline rising in her veins. And then she reached the cockpit door. Her hand hovered over the handle, fingers trembling, a knot of fear and anticipation coiling in her stomach. The engine's hum seemed to swell, louder, more insistent, filling her ears, vibrating through her bones. She could hear her own heartbeat, rapid, erratic. And as she pushed the door open, revealing the chaos within, a cold realization struck her. This was no longer a drill, no simulator, no practice. This was real, and the lives of everyone on this plane, including hers, now depended on what she did next. The cockpit was a storm of flashing lights, beeping alarms, and a co-pilot slumped over the controls. The captain's face was pale, sweat glistening on his forehead, eyes wide with fear yet full of pleading hope. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The engines roared beneath her. The plane shuddered as if aware of the untrained hands about to touch its controls, and the world seemed to narrow into a single, terrifying moment of clarity. One wrong move and they were done. Her hand trembled as she reached for the yoke. And then a voice, calm but piercing through the chaos, echoed in her mind. "This is it. You can do this." Claire's fingers trembled as she gripped the yoke. The cockpit smelled of overheated circuits and faint antiseptic. Red lights blinked relentlessly, warning alarms shrieked in overlapping tones, and the co-pilot slumped sideways, completely unconscious. The captain, pale and sweating, leaned against the dashboard, trying to gather composure. His hand rested lightly on the yoke, but his eyes were wide, filled with that terrifying mix of desperation and disbelief. I can help," Claire said again, louder this time, forcing herself to sound confident, though every muscle in her body screamed in panic. The first second stretched into eternity. Claire's heart hammered in her chest like a drum, each beat echoing the urgency of the moment. Around her, the cockpit instruments blinked in unison, demanding attention, demanding skill. The plane shuddered slightly, a subtle warning that the calm she had felt in row 13 moments ago had vanished. The faint hum of the engines now sounded more like a growl, alive, aware, testing her readiness. She swallowed hard, gripping the yoke tighter, forcing her hands not to shake. "Listen to me," the captain rasped, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "You need to keep us level, just keep us level until I can recover. Can you do that?" Claire nodded, though her head felt light, spinning. She had never been in a real cockpit emergency, only practiced in simulations where nothing truly mattered. This was real. Hundreds of lives, including her own, hung in the balance. Her eyes flicked over the dashboard, scanning instruments, dials, and switches. Numbers and symbols blurred together. She tried to recall every lesson, every simulated landing and takeoff, every emergency drill she'd ever been through. Her mind raced, searching for patterns, strategies, anything to stabilize the plane. The passengers in the cabin were silent, save for the occasional gasp or whimper. Claire could feel the tension radiating from them, a living pulse of fear that seemed to synchronize with the plane's slight jolts. The flight attendants hovered near the cockpit, faces pale, mouths moving in silent prayers. Claire's own throat felt dry. She forced herself to breathe deeply, grounding herself, focusing on the most basic command she remembered: keep the plane level, keep it steady. The captain attempted to regain control, his hand trembling as he gripped the yoke. "You're doing fine. Just follow my instructions. Don't panic." His words were meant to reassure her, but the tremor in his voice betrayed the reality. He wasn't sure if they would make it. Claire's stomach twisted. Every second felt magnified, each vibration of the engines coursing through her bones like a warning. She tried adjusting the controls gently, remembering the small corrective maneuvers from her lessons. The plane responded, but barely. It was alive, tense, and unforgiving. A sudden jolt threw Claire off balance, and the co-pilot's limp form slid slightly toward the console. The alarm screamed even louder. Lights flashed red, warning of possible engine strain. "We've got a turbulence pocket ahead," the captain shouted. Claire's pulse spiked. She had read about turbulence in manuals, studied it in simulators, but the theory was nothing compared to the violent shaking beneath her fingers. The plane lurched violently, and a scream pierced the cockpit from the cabin behind her. Claire felt herself gripping the yoke like a lifeline. The plane pitched slightly, threatening to tip sideways. She twisted the controls with cautious precision, recalling the mechanics of lift, thrust, and balance. Every motion was measured, yet instinctive. Sweat poured down her back, her hands slick against the smooth surface of the controls. The engines roared, the plane swaying under her fingers, and every second stretched, each one a battle between fear and resolve. The captain groaned, finally slumping in his seat. "I don't know if I can keep," his words trailed off. Claire's stomach sank. She realized the full weight of the moment. The responsibility was hers now. The plane was responding to her touch, but only barely. Outside, the clouds pressed close, gray and threatening, hiding the horizon. Lightning flashed faintly, illuminating the interior with ghostly strobe-light shadows. The plane shuddered again, more violently this time, as if challenging her competence. Claire's mind screamed with calculations and instructions she barely remembered. Adjust the flaps, reduce throttle slightly, correct the pitch, keep steady. Each tiny correction had immediate consequences. The plane's movement became a living dialogue with her hands, each adjustment a negotiation between physics and instinct. She felt like a tightrope walker, balancing on a wire that could snap at any second. The co-pilot remained unconscious, a silent reminder of the fragility of human life. In the cabin, the tension was palpable. She could hear the passengers praying, muttering names, whispering promises they would never forget. A child cried softly, a woman clutched her husband's arm, and a man muttered something inaudible under his breath. Claire's vision tunneled as she focused on the controls, her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Every second carried immense weight, and the plane's faint dips and lurches were constant reminders that failure was not an option. Then a new challenge arrived. A warning light blinked persistently on the dashboard. Engine 2 was showing abnormal pressure. The alarms became sharper, more insistent, and the captain groaned, gripping his head. Claire's stomach twisted. She had never dealt with a real engine failure, only simulations where failure was impossible. But this was no simulation. This was steel, wind, and gravity, carrying hundreds of lives at 30,000 feet. "Claire," the captain whispered, voice cracking slightly. We might have to make an emergency landing. I don't know if we—" She cut him off, her voice steadier than she felt. "Tell me what to do. I'll follow your instructions. Just guide me." His eyes locked onto hers, filled with desperate hope. He began issuing rapid instructions. Reduce throttle on the right engine. Adjust left flaps 10 degrees. Stabilize heading 270. Maintain altitude. Don't let her dip below 30,000. Claire's hands moved automatically, remembering the muscle memory of years of brief training. She followed each command, praying she wasn't overcorrecting, praying the plane would respond. The turbulence worsened. Rain pelted the windows, lightning flashed, and the plane lurched violently, threatening to spin. In the cabin, screams and cries pierced the hum of the engines. Claire gritted her teeth, forcing herself to ignore the chaos around her. Each second was critical, and hesitation could mean disaster. She adjusted the yoke again, trying to stabilize the plane, sweat blinding her vision as alarms continued to flash relentlessly. And then a sound from the radio crackled through, sharp and unexpected. "This is the FAA. We've detected an unusual flight pattern. Please identify your status immediately." Claire froze. She could hear the panic in the background, the urgency in the voice over the radio. Her hands gripped the yoke tighter. The captain muttered something under his breath, too low for her to catch. The engines whined, the plane shuddered, and outside, the storm seemed to grow larger, swallowing the horizon in a wall of gray. Every instinct screamed at her. This was bigger than turbulence, bigger than a simple emergency. The FAA was now involved. They were watching. They were waiting. And hundreds of lives were literally in her hands. Claire swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus. Her mind cycled through calculations, maneuvers, and memories of every flight lesson she'd taken, every simulator scenario she had survived. She realized the terrifying truth. She wasn't just helping the captain. She was flying the plane, alone. A final, violent jolt shook the cockpit, nearly toppling her over. Alarms screamed, instruments flashed, and through it all the captain slumped further, muttering prayers. Claire's heart pounded. She looked out the windshield at the gray, rolling clouds and glimpsed the faint outline of the Atlantic beneath them, endless and unforgiving. Her pulse raced, her hands were shaking, but she knew she had to act. She was the pilot now. The responsibility was hers. The plane lurched again, this time more violently, and Claire realized, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, that the storm wasn't finished with them yet. Claire's hands shook violently as she gripped the yoke, knuckles white. The cockpit's alarms screamed in a chaotic symphony, lights flashing red and orange, warning of critical issues. The plane had stabilized momentarily, but only barely. The storm outside raged, gray clouds churning with hidden fury, and a relentless wind buffeted the fuselage. Claire's mind raced, a torrent of equations, memories of flight lessons, and instinct colliding in a desperate attempt to make sense of the instruments before her. Each second felt stretched into eternity, the hum of the engines now a menacing growl beneath her fingertips. The captain's face was pale, sweat running in thin rivulets down his forehead. His hands shook as he tried to steady himself, one hand gripping the yoke while the other pressed against his chest, eyes darting between Claire and the blinking instruments. "Claire, you're doing fine. Just keep us level. Keep us steady until I can recover," he said, voice trembling slightly. The words should have calmed her, but instead, they amplified the reality of her situation. She was not just a passenger anymore. She was in command. Her thoughts flickered to her college flight simulator lessons, how she had practiced smooth takeoffs and landings countless times, in perfect weather with instructors watching, correcting mistakes immediately. None of that could prepare her for this. A steel tube carrying over 200 lives, trapped in a violent storm, a co-pilot unconscious and a captain barely conscious. Her stomach twisted, adrenaline surging. She had two options, freeze or act. There was no room for hesitation. Claire leaned forward, scanning the dashboard. Instruments glowed eerily in the dim cockpit light. Altimeter, airspeed, artificial horizon, throttle, rudder controls, all of it now demanded her attention simultaneously. She recalled the basic rules drilled into her memory. Maintain level flight first, then adjust heading, throttle, and altitude incrementally. Every motion had to be deliberate. Every second of indecision could send the plane spiraling into disaster. The captain let out a shaky breath. Throttle, just a slight increase. Keep level, don't overcorrect. Claire adjusted the throttle with trembling fingers. The engines whined in protest, but the plane responded, climbing gently, then leveling off. Her stomach lurched as a sudden gust of wind caught the wingtip, tilting the plane violently to the side. Alarms shrieked. Claire's heart raced as she fought the controls, twisting and pushing, trying to counter the motion. Sweat drenched her forehead, her palms were slick. Outside, the storm clouds twisted in unnatural shapes, and flashes of lightning illuminated the terrified faces of passengers through the cockpit windows. From behind her, the muffled cries and prayers of passengers echoed, amplifying her panic. She could hear children crying, women whispering prayers, men muttering frantic reassurances they barely believed. She focused on the instruments, tuning out the chaos. Each small adjustment had to be perfect. The plane responded slowly, but she could feel the fragile stability returning, if only by inches. Suddenly the captain slumped fully into his seat, unconscious. Claire's eyes widened. The full responsibility of the flight pressed down on her like a physical weight. The co-pilot was out, the captain incapacitated, and she, someone with only partial training, was now the sole pilot. Her mind screamed for calm, for clarity. You can do this. Remember the basics. Focus. One step at a time. Her fingers moved almost automatically, guided by instinct and half-remembered lessons. She leveled the wings, adjusted the throttle, and monitored the artificial horizon like a hawk. The plane groaned under the strain, shuddering with each gust of wind. Claire's pulse raced, each heartbeat echoing the tension of the cabin behind her. She could feel herself teetering on the edge of panic, but she forced herself to breathe steadily, focusing on the instruments, the yoke, and the path ahead. Then came the turbulence. The plane pitched violently, tilting as if trying to break free from her control. Lightning flashed, illuminating the cockpit in stark white bursts, revealing Claire's pale, sweating face and the frozen expressions of the passengers in the cabin. Alarms blared, shrill and insistent. Claire gritted her teeth, gripping the yoke tighter, making rapid, precise corrections. Her mind processed 1,000 calculations per second: wind speed, pitch angle, throttle adjustments, drag, lift. Every motion was a battle against physics itself, a fight for survival. Through the intercom, passengers murmured in terrified whispers, and one man shouted, "We're going to crash." The words hit Claire like a hammer, but she forced them aside. She couldn't afford to be paralyzed by fear. She had to act, focus, stabilize, keep steady, one movement at a time. The storm outside showed no mercy. Lightning struck closer this time, reflecting off the metallic fuselage and sending a bright flash across the cockpit. Claire's stomach twisted. Instruments flickered under the electrical strain. The plane shuddered violently again, tilting alarmingly to one side. Her hands moved instinctively, twisting, pushing, pulling, applying every ounce of strength to keep the aircraft under control. A low, deep rumble of thunder reverberated through the fuselage, shaking the floor beneath her feet. Claire's mind raced. She needed to stabilize, maintain altitude, avoid the storm's wrath. She remembered one critical lesson: do not overcorrect. Panic movements could make the situation worse. Slowly, painstakingly, she leveled the plane again. Sweat poured down her face. Her fingers were raw from gripping the yoke. Her lungs burned from rapid breathing. Yet for a fleeting moment the plane responded. It was still alive, still moving forward. She had control, fragile though it was. Then came the radio crackle, a sharp, urgent voice cutting through the storm. "This is FAA control. You are off your assigned flight path. Please identify yourself and stabilize immediately." Claire's pulse spiked. The captain groaned, mumbling incoherently, and the co-pilot remained lifeless. Her mind whirled. Restricted airspace, course deviation, storm turbulence. One wrong move and disaster would be unavoidable. She glanced at the instruments, recalculated the plane's trajectory, and adjusted the yoke accordingly. Every correction had to be precise, or the FAA warning would become irrelevant because the plane itself wouldn't survive. The passenger's fear was palpable. She could hear whispered prayers, the soft sobs of children, the muttered names of loved ones. Claire's throat went dry, but she forced herself to breathe evenly. Her hands and mind were locked in a desperate dance with physics. Each adjustment was a gamble. Each second counted. Failure was not an option. And then a sudden, violent gust hit the plane. The aircraft lurched violently, pitching sideways. Alarms blared like sirens. Claire's stomach dropped. Outside, the storm seemed to close in, the clouds twisting into unnatural shapes, the lightning striking with blinding fury. She fought the yoke, twisting, adjusting, pushing with all her strength, her knuckles white, sweat stinging her eyes. The plane responded, but barely. Claire realized something chilling. This was no ordinary storm. The turbulence was relentless, more aggressive than she had ever encountered, testing her, challenging her control. Every correction she made was met with resistance. The plane seemed alive, fighting back, mocking her in every violent lurch. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus. The storm would not win. She would not let it. Her gaze flicked to the cockpit door behind her. Flight attendants hovered, frozen in fear and hope. Passengers watched from the cabin with wide, terrified eyes. They had no idea the full extent of the crisis, and she had no time to explain. One misstep and everyone on board could be lost. The responsibility pressed down on her like an impossible weight, yet she forced herself to act. One step at a time. Stabilize. Survive. The plane lurched again, more violently than before, and Claire's stomach sank. Something wasn't right. She glanced at the instruments. Altitude dropping unexpectedly. One engine struggling, alarms blaring. The storm wasn't finished. The plane was not finished. And for the first time, Claire understood the terrifying truth. Surviving this storm was going to demand more than instinct. It was going to demand everything she had. Claire's hands trembled, yet she tightened her grip on the yoke, feeling the raw pulse of the plane beneath her fingers. The cockpit was a chaotic symphony of blaring alarms, blinking lights, and vibrating controls. Engine 2 was flickering dangerously. The airspeed indicator jerked erratically with each gust of wind. Claire's pulse raced, her mind spinning, yet she forced herself to focus, memorizing the patterns of the dials, gauges, and screens. Each movement of the yoke had a direct, immediate consequence. The plane was alive, and it was testing her every nerve. The captain slumped further in his seat, pale and sweating. He tried to speak but could barely form words. Claire glanced at him, realizing the frightening truth. She might have to fly this plane alone. Her heart thumped against her ribcage like a drum, adrenaline coursing through every vein. She had never flown solo at this altitude, let alone under these conditions, with a storm trying to rip the plane apart. Sweat stung her eyes and her palms were slick. She pressed forward, forcing herself to ignore the nausea twisting her stomach. Outside the cockpit window, lightning split the gray sky in jagged arcs, illuminating the panicked faces of passengers. Clouds swirled like a living storm, rushing toward the plane with relentless speed. Rain hammered the fuselage, creating a deafening roar, and gusts rocked the wings violently. Claire fought to keep the plane level, twisting the yoke with precise, cautious movements. Each lurch sent a jolt through her body. She felt every tremor as if it were a personal blow, every alarm a hammer against her concentration. The co-pilot remained slumped over the controls, motionless, a silent reminder of the fragility of human life. Claire's stomach twisted with dread as she adjusted the throttle, increasing Engine 1's power while carefully reducing Engine 2. Alarms shrieked in response, yet the plane finally stabilized for a fleeting moment. She let out a shallow breath, though she knew the relief was temporary. Outside, the storm was far from finished. A crackling voice interrupted the cockpit's tense silence. "This is FAA control. You are off your assigned flight path. Please identify yourself and stabilize immediately." Claire's pulse spiked. Her mind raced. Restricted airspace, turbulence, engine strain. She had to act immediately. One wrong move and disaster was inevitable. "Throttle adjust left by 10 degrees. Rudder 20 degrees right," the captain gasped, struggling to form words. Claire followed instructions to the letter, muscles tense, mind locked in high-speed calculations. The plane responded, yet not perfectly. She felt the difference, a slight drift, a minor tilt, the subtle shift of gravity tugging at her chest. The storm seemed to press harder, wind ripping at the wings, rain lashing the windows, lightning striking in terrifying proximity. Claire's gaze flicked to the instrument panel. Engine 2 was faltering further, the pressure gauge dipping dangerously low. She had read about engine failure in manuals, studied it in simulators, but this was real. Each second counted. Every movement could save lives or end them. She adjusted the throttle carefully, trying to balance the engines. The plane lurched violently, a violent twist that threatened to tip it sideways. Claire's stomach dropped. "Focus on stabilization," she whispered to herself. "Level wings. Maintain altitude, one correction at a time." She leaned into the controls, twisting, pushing, adjusting with all her strength. Sweat drenched her hair and soaked her uniform. Her hands burned from gripping the yoke so tightly. Every nerve in her body was on edge. And then, for a fleeting second, a small victory, the plane leveled. But the storm wasn't finished. Lightning flashed, illuminating the turbulent clouds outside, revealing the shadow of the ocean far below. Rain pelted the fuselage, vibrating through the metal and glass, a relentless percussion that mirrored her frantic heartbeat. The engines roared in protest as she carefully adjusted them, trying to counter the violent gusts. The plane dipped slightly, then stabilized again. Each small correction was a triumph, yet she knew it would not last. The storm was relentless, testing her resolve with every passing second. A sudden, sharp jolt threw her forward, nearly knocking her against the dashboard. Instruments flickered, and a shrill alarm pierced her ears. Engine 2's warning lights flashed red, more insistent than before. The captain groaned, muttering under his breath. Claire's stomach twisted with fear. She realized they might not make it through this without encountering something worse, something the storm was hiding, something unpredictable. The flight attendants' faces pressed against the cockpit door, frozen in a mixture of hope and terror. Passengers whispered prayers, cried softly, or clutched hands in silent desperation. Claire forced herself to tune out the chaos, focusing solely on the plane. She adjusted the yoke, correcting a subtle roll to the left, then nudged the throttle, balancing the struggling engines. The plane responded, quivering under her hands, but it moved forward, alive yet fragile. Then came a new, terrifying sound, a sudden alarm indicating a potential altitude drop. Claire's stomach lurched. She glanced at the altimeter, 30,000 feet, dropping fast. Panic tried to claw its way in, but she forced it down, pushing fear aside. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself. "Stabilize, level, control." She pulled back gently on the yoke, resisting the plane's violent dip. The engines roared louder, a desperate protest to the correction. Lightning flashed again, this time illuminating the full fury of the storm. The wings rocked violently as if being torn from the fuselage. The plane shuddered, a deep bone-jarring vibration running through the cockpit. Claire's mind raced, flaps, throttle, rudder, heading. Every adjustment had to be precise. Every second was a delicate dance with disaster. Outside, the clouds pressed closer, the rain became a battering wall, and the storm seemed to stretch on infinitely, testing her resolve. She realized the terrifying truth. The plane was alive, and it was challenging her, testing her every movement. One wrong input, one hesitation, and the aircraft could spin uncontrollably, sending everyone on board to a grim fate. She had to be perfect. She had to survive. The captain's eyes fluttered open briefly. You're doing it," he rasped, voice hoarse. Claire gave a faint nod but didn't allow herself any relief. There was no time for satisfaction. The plane shuddered again and she could feel the turbulence increasing, more violent, more unpredictable. A sudden thought struck her: this storm might not just be random weather. The FAA warning, the erratic instruments. Something about this felt off, something dangerous beyond just the storm. Claire swallowed hard. She knew she had to hold the plane together. The passengers' lives, the captain, the co-pilot, and her own, everything depended on her next moves. She adjusted the yoke, leveled the wings once more, nudged the throttle, and tried to maintain altitude. The plane responded slightly, shuddering under her hands, but it was a fragile equilibrium. Then a deafening roar of wind tore across the fuselage. The plane lurched violently to the left. Instruments flickered. Alarms screamed. Lightning struck almost directly ahead, illuminating the turbulent sky in an ominous glow. Claire's heart raced. Her stomach flipped. Every muscle in her body screamed with tension. She realized with bone-deep clarity, surviving this storm was not just about skill. It was about instinct, courage, and sheer willpower. Her gaze flicked to the cockpit door. Flight attendants pressed their faces to the window, eyes wide with terror and hope. Passengers whispered, cried, and prayed behind them. Claire knew they had no idea the full extent of the crisis. She alone was the thin line between survival and catastrophe. The yoke vibrated violently beneath her hands, the engines protested, and the storm's fury pressed against the plane like an unstoppable force. Claire inhaled sharply. She could not fail. She would not fail. Every ounce of focus, every shred of training, every instinct would be pushed to its limit. The plane might be alive, but only if she could keep it that way. She pressed her hands harder against the controls, eyes locked on the instruments, every fiber of her being alert and ready. And then a sudden, sharp warning light flashed. Engine 1 was overheating. Claire's stomach dropped. Her pulse surged. The plane groaned under the strain. The storm wasn't done with them yet. And she realized something chilling. The next move she made could decide everything, life or death for everyone on board. Claire's heart hammered in her chest, a rapid drumbeat that echoed the shrill alarms around her. Engine 1's overheating warning glowed red, the indicator flickering with increasing urgency. The plane groaned under the strain, a deep metallic moan that vibrated through her bones. Outside, the storm was a living, breathing entity, dark, violent, and unyielding. Rain pelted the fuselage in blinding sheets. Lightning stabbed across the gray sky in jagged bursts, illuminating the terrified faces of passengers through the cockpit windows. Claire's stomach lurched. The co-pilot remained unconscious, slumped across the console, a silent and terrifying reminder that the stakes were life and death. The captain's face was pale, lips pressed into a thin line, eyes wide with fear, though he tried to remain calm enough to provide guidance. "Claire, throttle gently, flare slightly, don't overcompensate," he rasped. Claire's fingers moved almost automatically, twisting and pushing with precise urgency, each adjustment a desperate conversation with physics itself. The turbulence intensified. The plane pitched violently to the left, then right, shuddering as the engine strained against the violent gusts. Claire's pulse raced, sweat pouring down her face, blurring her vision. She forced herself to breathe evenly, focusing on the instruments and the yoke, blocking out the chaos behind her. Every second was a battle against the storm, against gravity, against sheer panic. From behind the cockpit, the sounds of fear were palpable. Children whimpered softly, parents whispered prayers, and flight attendants flitted nervously between seats, their faces masks of tension. Claire could feel their fear, almost like a physical weight pressing on her back, but she couldn't let it distract her. She had to act. She had to survive. She had to keep the plane in the sky. A sudden jolt nearly threw her forward, the plane tilting alarmingly as a gust of wind caught the wingtip. Alarms shrieked. Claire's stomach flipped violently. She twisted the yoke, nudged the throttle, and applied the rudder controls, desperately fighting the tilt. Her mind raced, cycling through every emergency maneuver she had ever practiced. One wrong move could send them spiraling into the ocean below. Her fingers burned from gripping the controls so tightly, but she forced herself to remain steady. Altitude dropping, the captain shouted, his voice strained. Claire's eyes darted to the altimeter, 30,000 feet dropping fast. The engine screamed as she made a sharp correction, tugging the yoke to stabilize the plane. The wings leveled slightly, but the turbulence was relentless. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, a blinding bolt that reflected across the cockpit panels. Claire's pulse spiked. The plane shuddered violently, threatening to roll onto its side. She leaned into the controls, forcing her weight, twisting, nudging, adjusting. The storm seemed to sense her fear, battering the fuselage with renewed ferocity. Rain stung the windows like a barrage of tiny missiles, wind howled around the plane, and the engines whined in protest. Each adjustment she made brought only temporary relief. She realized that surviving this storm would demand more than skill. It would demand instinct, courage, and sheer determination. The captain groaned again, trying to speak. "Brace for sudden drop," he rasped, voice barely audible. Claire's stomach dropped as the plane lurched violently downward. Alarms blared, lights flashed, and the yoke vibrated under her hands. Her hands were numb from tension, but she forced herself to react, pulling back gently while nudging the rudder to correct the tilt. The plane responded, but only slightly, wobbling in the turbulent air like a leaf in a storm. Suddenly, a loud metallic bang echoed through the fuselage. Claire's eyes widened. She glanced at the instruments. Engine 2 was failing faster, pressure dropping dangerously. A wave of panic threatened to overtake her, but she pushed it aside, focusing on the only thing she could control, keeping the plane airborne. Every instinct screamed at her. This was no ordinary storm. Something about the turbulence, the engine behavior, even the FAA warnings felt unnatural, deliberate. Her hands moved with precision, correcting pitch and yaw, adjusting throttle in delicate increments. The plane leveled slightly, then shuddered again, responding reluctantly to her commands. Sweat poured down her back and her vision tunneled. She could hear the passengers' muted cries and whispered prayers through the cockpit door. Every sound was a reminder of the stakes. Hundreds of lives depended on her. She could not fail. She would not fail. Then came the next jolt, sudden, violent, and terrifying. The plane pitched sharply downward, alarms blaring, warning lights flashing red across the dashboard. Claire's stomach dropped as she fought the controls, twisting, nudging, pulling with every ounce of strength she could summon. The engines roared in protest and the plane shuddered violently, teetering on the edge of control. A scream echoed from the cabin behind her. "Hold on," Claire shouted, though she had no one to hear her except the captain, who slumped in his seat, pale and weak. The plane wobbled again, this time dangerously close to tipping sideways. Her mind raced, calculating, remembering, improvising. She needed to stabilize immediately or everything would be lost. She adjusted the yoke slightly, applied the rudder, and nudged the throttle. The plane responded just enough to prevent a catastrophic roll. Lightning flashed directly ahead, illuminating the gray chaos outside. Rain pounded the fuselage, wind howled with renewed fury, and the plane's wings rocked violently. Claire's heart raced. Each second was a battle against death itself. She could feel the raw power of the storm pressing against the plane, testing her every nerve, every instinct. Yet somehow she kept it level. Somehow she kept it alive. "Claire," the captain whispered, voice trembling. You're keeping us flying." His words were barely audible, but they struck her with profound weight. She wasn't just a passenger. She wasn't just a student of flight. She was the only thing keeping the plane from plunging into disaster. Every decision, every adjustment, every heartbeat mattered. Then a sudden, violent jolt shook the cockpit. The plane lurched to the left, wings tilting dangerously. Alarms blared, instruments flickered. Claire's stomach flipped as she fought the controls with desperate precision. Lightning struck nearby, illuminating the cockpit in stark white flashes. Outside, the storm seemed infinite, a wall of gray fury pressing against the plane. The engine warning lights pulsed violently. Claire's pulse spiked. Engine 1 was overheating, Engine 2 faltering. The plane shuddered under the strain, responding sluggishly to her corrections. Panic threatened to rise again, but she forced herself to focus. Stabilize. Level. Survive. She leaned into the yoke, making tiny, deliberate adjustments, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. A crackling voice cut through the cockpit noise. "This is air traffic control. You are dangerously off course. Immediate corrective action required." Claire's chest tightened. She glanced at the instruments, calculated the heading deviation, and nudged the controls. The plane responded only partially. Outside, lightning struck closer, rain pelted harder, and the turbulence intensified. Every second stretched into an eternity. Every moment was a negotiation between skill, instinct, and sheer willpower. Claire realized with bone-deep clarity they were on the edge. One more gust, one more misstep, and disaster was inevitable. Her fingers burned, her muscles screamed, her lungs ached, but she could not stop. She had to keep the plane alive. She had to survive. She had to keep the hundreds of lives on board intact. Then a new, terrifying realization hit her. The storm was not the only danger. The engine failures, the erratic behavior, even the FAA warnings suggested something else, something she couldn't yet see, something she would have to face before they could ever land safely. Claire's heart thundered in her chest. She took a deep breath, gripping the yoke with all her strength, and whispered to herself, "This is it. The real test begins now." Claire's palms burned against the yoke, fingers slick with sweat as the plane groaned beneath her. Engine 1's temperature climbed dangerously high, while Engine 2 sputtered in protest. Outside, the storm raged like a living beast, lightning stabbing the sky in violent arcs, rain slamming the fuselage with relentless force, and wind gusts twisting the wings violently. Every second was a battle for survival. Every motion of the yoke was a negotiation with physics itself. The captain slumped further, barely conscious, muttering incoherently. Claire glanced at him briefly, then returned to the instruments. She had no time for hesitation. She was alone now in everything that truly mattered: the responsibility, the lives on board, the fragile steel tube hurtling through a storm that seemed determined to destroy it. Her heart raced, muscles tensed, mind calculating at a pace faster than she knew was humanly possible. The plane pitched sharply to the right, alarms screaming. Claire's stomach lurched. She twisted the yoke, nudged the throttle, and applied the rudder. The plane responded, but slowly, as if resisting her control. Sweat stung her eyes and her vision tunneled. The cabin behind her was a blur of terrified faces, whispered prayers, and quiet sobs. She could feel the fear pressing through the cockpit door like a tangible force. But there was no time to comfort anyone. Survival required total focus. A warning light flashed violently. Engine 1 was now critically overheated. Claire's pulse jumped. The plane groaned under the strain, threatening to tilt sideways, and she realized the engines might fail entirely. Her hands tightened on the yoke. She had read about dual engine failures in manuals, studied simulations in college, but this was no simulation. This was real, and hundreds of lives, including her own, depended on her decisions. "Claire," the captain rasped, voice barely audible. You're holding it, keep her steady." She swallowed hard, nodding, though she knew he might not see her gesture. The plane lurched again violently, a gust catching the right wing. She twisted the yoke sharply, countering the tilt, then nudged the throttle to balance engine output. The plane leveled slightly. Her stomach twisted with the realization. Even the smallest mistake could be catastrophic. Each adjustment had to be perfect, measured, deliberate. Lightning struck directly ahead, illuminating the storm in stark white flashes. Rain pelted like shards of glass. The plane quivered violently, and Claire realized they were not just in a storm, they were inside its heart. Each gust of wind seemed to test her, each flash of lightning a reminder of the chaos outside. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to focus. Stabilize. Level. Survive. Another warning blared, fuel imbalance detected. Claire's chest tightened. She glanced at the instrument panel, calculating rapidly. Engine 1 was overheating, Engine 2 faltering, and fuel distribution was uneven. The plane groaned under the strain, responding sluggishly to her adjustments. Her hands moved almost instinctively, twisting, nudging, applying pressure to counter the shifts. Each correction was met with violent resistance, each second a gamble with survival. From the cabin came cries and whispers. Children whimpered softly, parents prayed, flight attendants froze, eyes wide with fear. Claire ignored them. She could feel the tension radiating from the cabin, almost like a physical weight pressing on her back. But she had to stay focused. Every second mattered. Every movement mattered. The lives of everyone on board rested on her. The plane pitched violently again, rolling slightly to the left. Alarms shrieked, instruments flickered. Claire's stomach flipped. She pushed back on the yoke, nudged the rudder, adjusted throttle, balancing the faltering engines as best she could. The plane leveled just barely. She exhaled sharply, though she knew there was no time to relax. The storm was far from over. A crackling voice interrupted the cockpit noise. "This is air traffic control. You are dangerously off course. Immediate corrective action required." Claire's chest tightened. She glanced at the heading indicator. They were veering dangerously off their flight path. She adjusted the controls, nudging the plane back toward the correct heading, but the storm resisted, each gust twisting the fuselage, each lurch threatening to throw them into chaos. Her heart pounded, adrenaline coursing through her veins. This was beyond anything she had trained for, beyond anything she had imagined. The captain's eyes fluttered open briefly. You're doing it," he rasped. Claire nodded faintly, but there was no time for relief. The plane lurched again, a violent roll that almost threw her from her seat. Outside, lightning illuminated the storm like a living nightmare. The engines roared, each shuddering movement testing her skill, her patience, her will. Her hands ached, muscles screamed, but she couldn't stop. The plane wobbled, then leveled slightly. Sweat streamed down her face. Her lungs burned, her vision blurred. But she forced herself to breathe evenly, to focus, to calculate every movement, stabilize, maintain altitude, control the plane. Suddenly, a metallic bang echoed through the fuselage. Claire froze. She glanced at the instruments. Engine 1 was failing faster, the warning lights flashing red and pressure dropping dangerously. The plane shuddered violently, teetering on the edge of control. A scream from the cabin behind her pierced her focus, but she ignored it, forcing her attention entirely on the controls. "Brace for turbulence," the captain shouted, voice hoarse. Claire's stomach lurched as the plane dipped sharply. She pulled back gently on the yoke, nudged the rudder, and adjusted the throttle. The plane responded partially, but the turbulence was relentless. Lightning flashed directly outside the windshield, illuminating the chaos in stark, violent bursts. The storm seemed to stretch infinitely, a wall of fury pressing against the plane. Her mind raced, engine failure imminent, altitude dropping, heading off course, turbulence relentless. She realized with chilling clarity that they might not survive if another crisis hit. She had to anticipate the next move, predict the storm's fury, act before the chaos consumed them. Her hands moved with precision, almost instinctively, balancing, nudging, correcting. Each movement was a lifeline, a delicate thread holding hundreds of lives in the air. The plane quivered violently again, almost tipping to the side. Claire pressed her foot against the rudder, twisted the yoke, nudged the throttle. Slowly, painfully, the plane leveled, trembling under her touch. Sweat poured down her face, eyes stinging, heart racing. She knew the storm wasn't done, not by far. Then a sudden, violent jolt. The plane lurched violently downward, alarms screaming, instruments flashing red. Engine 2 sputtered, warning lights blinking. Claire's pulse spiked. She realized the terrifying truth. The storm was only going to get worse. She had reached the edge of control. One more misstep, one more gust, and disaster could strike. Her stomach dropped. Every second mattered. Every decision mattered. She had to hold on. She had to survive. She had to keep the plane alive. And then through the chaos, a voice echoed from the intercom, a calm, commanding tone cutting through the storm. "This is the FAA. We are tracking your flight. Please be advised. A severe microburst is detected ahead. You must take immediate evasive action." Claire's breath caught. She glanced at the instruments, calculating rapidly. Microburst, an almost impossible challenge for even the most experienced pilots. The plane shuddered violently, responding sluggishly to her adjustments. Sweat poured down her face. Muscles burned. Adrenaline coursed through her veins. The storm was pushing them to the very edge. Claire realized with bone-deep clarity, surviving this would demand more than skill. It would demand instinct, courage, and every ounce of will she possessed. She gripped the yoke tighter, adjusted throttle, nudged the rudder, and whispered to herself, "We're not done yet. We can survive. We will survive." The storm roared outside, the engine screamed, the plane shuddered violently. And in that moment, Claire understood something terrifying. The next few seconds would decide everything. Claire's knuckles were white, gripping the yoke as the plane trembled under the storm's relentless assault. The sky outside was a roiling wall of gray and black, lightning striking violently in jagged flashes that illuminated the terrified faces of passengers in brief, ghostly bursts. Rain hammered the fuselage like hail, wind gusts buffeted the wings, and the engine screamed in desperate protest. Engine 1 was critically overheated. Engine 2 sputtered and threatened to fail completely. The plane quivered violently, teetering on the edge of chaos. Claire's heart pounded, every nerve on fire. The captain's breathing was shallow, his forehead slick with sweat. "Claire, listen, you need to hold her steady until his words trailed off, his body slumping forward. Claire glanced at him and realized with sudden, bone-deep clarity, she was the pilot now, fully. No one else could save this flight. The responsibility pressed on her chest like a physical weight. Hundreds of lives depended on her hands, her decisions, her instincts. The turbulence intensified. A sudden, violent gust slammed the right wing, tilting the plane sharply. Alarms shrieked, lights flashed red and orange, and the fuselage shuddered. Claire's stomach lurched. She twisted the yoke sharply, nudged the rudder, and adjusted throttle to balance the struggling engines. The plane leveled for a heartbeat before another violent gust threatened to tip it sideways again. Each second was a battle against chaos, a delicate negotiation with physics itself. From the cabin came panicked cries, whispered prayers, and the soft sobs of children. Flight attendants pressed their hands together in silent hope, faces pale with fear. Claire forced herself to tune it all out. She had no choice. She had to focus entirely on the cockpit, on the instruments, on the delicate thread of control she clung to. Every movement of her hands, every calculation in her mind was a lifeline. Suddenly another alarm blared, a high-pitched, insistent scream. Engine 2 was failing. The warning lights pulsed violently. Claire's chest tightened. The plane groaned under the strain, threatening to tilt violently. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes. Her fingers were numb from tension, muscles aching, lungs burning from adrenaline. She could feel the plane testing her, pushing her to the very edge of human endurance. "This is it," she whispered to herself, voice barely audible over the alarms, "the real test. The storm is not done with us yet." She leaned into the controls, twisting, pushing, adjusting, balancing the failing engines, nudging the rudder, gently flaring the yoke to maintain altitude. Each correction brought only fleeting stability. The plane responded sluggishly, like a creature resisting her control, but it remained in the air, just barely. Lightning struck closer than ever, illuminating the clouds in a stark white flash. The plane shuddered violently, pitching forward as if the storm itself wanted to pull it down. Claire fought the controls, her stomach dropping with every movement. She could hear the passengers' cries and whispers behind her, a haunting backdrop to the chaos in the cockpit. This was no simulation. This was reality, raw and unforgiving. A crackling voice came over the radio, urgent and sharp. "Air traffic control. Microburst detected directly ahead. Immediate evasive action required. Advise intentions." Claire's pulse spiked. Microburst, she had studied them in manuals, seen simulations, but nothing prepared her for this. These sudden, violent downdrafts could tear the plane from the sky in seconds. She glanced at the altimeter, 30,000 feet, dropping fast. Engine 1 on the brink. Engine 2 faltering. The storm pressing in from all sides. Her mind raced. Every instinct screamed, "Act now or it's over." She adjusted the yoke, applied the rudder, and nudged the throttle, each movement precise and deliberate. The plane responded partially, tilting slightly but not collapsing entirely. A shudder ran through the fuselage. Claire's stomach twisted. The storm was relentless, almost sentient, testing every ounce of her focus, her skill, her courage. She realized with chilling clarity that surviving this would demand more than skill. It would demand instinct, timing, and pure will. The captain groaned, barely conscious. "Brace, Claire, brace, turbulence." His words were fragmented, but the warning hit her with full force. The plane lurched violently downward, a sharp, terrifying drop. Claire's stomach dropped as she reacted instinctively, pulling back on the yoke while nudging the throttle and applying precise rudder pressure. The plane leveled momentarily, then quivered violently again. Sweat streamed down her face, mixing with tears she didn't allow herself to acknowledge. Her muscles screamed, lungs burned, but she had to hold on. The plane's wings rocked violently, almost tipping to one side. Alarms blared, warning lights flashed. The storm roared outside, relentless and unyielding. Each second was a battle, each movement a lifeline. One miscalculation and everything would be lost. Suddenly, a new crisis hit. The flaps were frozen. She had tried to adjust them earlier, but one wing's flaps refused to respond. This imbalance could send the plane into a spin at any moment. Panic clawed at her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. She adjusted the yoke, balanced throttle output, applied rudder, and gently countered the roll. The plane responded, just barely, teetering on the edge of disaster. Lightning flashed again, blindingly close. Rain lashed the windshield, wind howled through the fuselage, and the plane shuddered violently. Claire's mind raced. Emergency landing options, microburst trajectory, engine strain, fuel levels, altitude, speed. Every variable mattered. Every second counted. She had no choice but to act decisively. She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to focus. There was only one option. She would have to guide the plane through the microburst, risking it all, timing her maneuvers perfectly, balancing the failing engines, dodging the storm's deadliest gusts. Her hands moved with instinctive precision, twisting, nudging, balancing, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. Outside, the storm roared like a living thing, lightning striking close enough to illuminate the terrified passengers behind her. Rain pelted the fuselage, wind howled, and turbulence battered the plane. The engines protested with loud, metallic screams. Claire's heart hammered. Every second stretched into eternity. Every movement was a gamble with life itself. She felt the plane begin to tilt dangerously as they entered the heart of the microburst. Instinct took over. She twisted the yoke, nudged the throttle, applied rudder pressure, and leaned into the controls with all her strength. The plane responded slightly, teetering but holding. The microburst hit with full force, tossing the aircraft violently, testing her skill to the absolute limit. Lightning flashed directly outside the windshield, illuminating the storm's full fury. The plane quivered violently, wings rocking dangerously. Claire's pulse surged. She could feel the raw power of the storm pressing against the fuselage, threatening to rip them apart. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to breathe, to focus, to act. Every motion, every calculation, every heartbeat mattered. And then a sudden, violent roar, a shudder unlike any before. The plane lurched sharply, alarms screaming, instruments flickering. Engine 1 faltered, Engine 2 sputtered. Claire's stomach dropped. She realized with bone-deep clarity the next few seconds would determine everything. Her eyes locked on the instruments, calculating, anticipating. Her hands moved instinctively, perfectly, balancing, correcting, compensating. The microburst battered the plane from every side. Lightning illuminated the chaos outside. Rain lashed with blinding intensity. The engine screamed, threatening failure. And still, she held the plane. Claire swallowed hard, heart pounding. She knew they were not safe yet. The storm was relentless. The engines were critical. The plane teetered on the edge of control. One more gust, one more miscalculation, one more second of delay, and disaster would strike. She gritted her teeth, tightened her grip, and whispered to herself, We will survive. We will make it. Then a blinding flash of lightning revealed the final challenge. The approaching coastline, barely visible through the storm, with no time for hesitation. Claire's hands were raw, muscles burning, sweat stinging her eyes as she gripped the yoke. The plane groaned beneath her, quivering with every gust of wind, every violent drop, every jolt from the storm. The coastline was barely visible through the sheets of rain and darkness, a jagged, shadowy line threatening to appear and vanish with each flicker of lightning. She could see no runway clearly, no safe landing path, only the raging storm pressing against them, demanding her precision, her courage, her very survival. "Claire," the captain's voice was faint, almost drowned out by the storm, but he pressed a trembling hand to hers on the yoke. You've done amazing. Now land her carefully." He slumped back, exhausted, leaving her fully in command. Her heart raced. Every soul on board depended on her now. She had done everything else, held the plane together, navigated the microburst, balanced failing engines. But now the impossible remained, the landing. She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to focus, to block out panic, to calculate everything simultaneously. Descent rate, airspeed, engine output, wind shear, runway alignment. The engines groaned in protest, both struggling under the strain, warning lights blinking incessantly. Her hands ached, her muscles screamed, but she refused to let go. Steady, level, descend, precision. The storm wasn't done. Rain pelted like bullets, the plane shuddered violently, lightning stabbed dangerously close, and turbulence threatened to throw them into chaos at any moment. The runway appeared, glimpsed briefly through the storm, a thin, wet strip of asphalt, shining under emergency lights, beckoning like a fragile promise. Claire adjusted the yoke, nudged the throttle, carefully balanced the failing engines, guiding the plane toward it with painstaking precision. A sudden gust slammed the right wing, tilting the plane dangerously. Claire's stomach dropped. She twisted the yoke sharply, countered with the rudder, nudged the throttle, and held her breath. The plane leveled, teetering precariously, a fragile thread of control holding them above disaster. She could hear passengers' panicked whispers behind the cockpit door, prayers, sobs, and gasps. She forced herself to focus. There was no room for fear, no room for hesitation. The runway lights grew brighter through the storm, but so did the turbulence. Another gust slammed the left wing, tossing the plane like a toy. Claire's hands moved almost instinctively, countering, nudging, adjusting. She had practiced landings countless times in simulators, but nothing could prepare her for this. A fully loaded aircraft, engines failing in a violent storm, hundreds of lives on board, and the fragile runway ahead barely visible. Every movement mattered. Every second mattered. The altimeter showed 30,000 feet, descending rapidly. The engine strained, warning lights pulsing red. Claire's chest tightened. One mistake now could undo everything she had fought to accomplish. She adjusted the yoke, nudged the throttle, applied precise rudder pressure. The plane leveled slightly, trembling under her touch. She whispered to herself, heart pounding, "Steady, focus, land her safely." Lightning flashed directly ahead, illuminating the runway in stark white. Rain lashed against the windshield, wind howled like a living thing, and the plane shuddered violently. The engine screamed in protest, each vibration sending a jolt through her arms. She could feel the raw fury of the storm pressing against the fuselage, testing her skill, her courage, her willpower. The final approach was terrifyingly close. She had to keep the plane level, maintain just enough speed to stay aloft, while descending carefully, avoiding the gusts and crosswinds that threatened to throw them into chaos. Her hands ached from tension, muscles trembling, eyes stinging from sweat and rain. But she could not falter. She had trained for this moment her entire life, even if she hadn't known it. "Brace!" she shouted over the roar of the storm, though the passengers were already gripping their seats, eyes wide with fear. The plane dipped, shuddered, then leveled, teetering above the slick runway. Claire nudged the throttle, adjusted the yoke, and carefully guided the aircraft down inch by inch. The wheels touched the wet asphalt with a jarring thud, the plane bouncing slightly, then settling. But the storm wasn't finished. Wind gusts slammed the wings, rain poured relentlessly, and engine sputters threatened to destabilize the fragile balance. Claire kept the yoke steady, correcting minor deviations, countering the turbulence with precise movements. The plane skidded along the wet runway, metal groaning under the strain, tires hissing against the rain-slick surface. Her pulse pounded, adrenaline coursing through every vein, but she forced herself to stay calm, steady, straight, controlled. The runway lights stretched out behind her, signaling the long path of survival already achieved. Engine 1 was overheating, Engine 2 sputtering, but the plane was moving forward, alive, controlled by her hands. The passengers' whispers and cries grew louder as relief began to mingle with fear. They could see the runway ahead, see the fragile promise of safety. But the storm still raged around them, testing her with every gust, every lightning strike, every torrent of rain. She felt the plane slow, wheels gripping the wet asphalt. She applied gentle braking, adjusted throttle, corrected minor skids caused by the wind. The plane groaned, shuddered, then finally came to a stop, trembling, soaked, but intact. Claire exhaled sharply, her body sagging with exhaustion. Her hands shook violently, fingers numb from gripping the yoke for what felt like an eternity. Sweat streamed down her face, mixing with tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed. The cockpit was silent for a moment, except for the residual groans of the plane and the faint sobs of relief from the passengers. Claire's chest heaved. She had done it. Against impossible odds, in the heart of a storm with failing engines, she had landed the plane. She had survived. They had survived. The captain slumped forward, exhausted, and then managed a weak smile. "Claire, you saved everyone," he rasped. His words carried the weight of every life on board, every prayer whispered, every fear overcome. Claire nodded faintly, tears stinging her eyes. She couldn't speak. There was nothing to say that could capture the intensity of what had just occurred. From the cabin came a cacophony of applause, cheers, sobs, and whispered prayers of thanks. Flight attendants hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces. Passengers wept openly, holding children close, grasping hands, whispering words of gratitude. Claire felt a wave of emotion wash over her, relief, exhaustion, disbelief, and overwhelming pride. She had done the impossible. Outside, the storm began to break, lightning still flashing but the winds weakening, the rain lessening. The sun was beginning to pierce the gray clouds in thin shafts of light, as if acknowledging the miracle that had just occurred. Claire looked out at the wet runway, at the storm-tossed sky, and felt the surreal weight of reality. She had survived. Hundreds of lives had survived. Her hand slowly released the yoke, trembling violently. She sat back, eyes closing briefly, letting herself finally exhale. The captain reached over, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You're extraordinary," he said softly. Claire nodded, a small, exhausted smile crossing her face. But in the back of her mind, the adrenaline still hummed. She knew she would never forget this flight. The storm, the microburst, the failing engines, the fear, the responsibility, it would stay with her forever. She had faced the edge of disaster and pulled everyone back from it. She had been terrified, exhausted, and alone in every critical moment. Yet she had prevailed. The passengers began to disembark, their faces filled with awe, relief, and gratitude. Reporters would later call it a miraculous landing. Experts would analyze every detail, amazed that anyone could have survived such a storm. But Claire knew the truth. It wasn't luck. It wasn't miracles. It was focus, courage, instinct, and an unyielding refusal to give in to fear. As the last passenger left the plane, Claire remained in the cockpit for a moment, hands still trembling, heart still pounding. The storm clouds began to part, revealing a pale sliver of sunlight over the horizon. She allowed herself a quiet smile, exhausted but victorious. She had survived the impossible. She had saved them all. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Claire allowed herself to rest, knowing she had done something that no one would ever forget. The end.